Ah, I got a good one for you. An astrophysicist and a hypnotist walk into a bar, and oh, and I'll call you back. Sorry, guys, we're closed.
Sleep! Never mind. Can I have a drink? It's been a long day.
Fine. What do you want?
Can I have a shot of placebo and a trance chaser, please?
I'll have some dark matter in a black hole.
You guys should start a podcast.
Why?
Because you're mad.
So I'm telling you, that's what I'm seeing. I'm seeing that consciousness creates a waveform that you guys call string theory that starts to vibrate into reality, and that's what we call simulation theory. That's because that coding is based on consciousness and thought. Yeah.
Hello,
Hi.
I'm Cynthiana Poduroyo,
I'm Joe Tabanella
and we're minds
against
dogma.
Dogma.
That makes us mad.
That makes us mad. Yeah. This is a podcast where we challenge dogma, and then
Challenge the challenger of dogma.
why is that important?
Because we need freedom of exploration in order to make discoveries and breakthroughs. And I feel that in academia and even outside academia, in many other disciplines, not just the academic ones, it's very hard to go against dogma. And I want to give a platform to people who are challenging dogma. I want to be able to discuss it with an open mind. And I think this is important for progress. It's also important for putting a couple of disciplines together, bringing the conversation in a zone in which everyone can express their opinions and their ideas.
So, do you think that dogma is something that people just naturally gravitate towards because of the personality type, or?
Well, that's a question that I wanted to ask you to begin with.
I guess we'll get into that.
Yeah, you're a hypnotherapist and a neuro-linguistic programming instructor, and you also teach biofeedback. And before I ask you what type of personality is actually attracted to an environment that's dogmatic, tell me a little bit about your journey.
I've always been fascinated about anomalous events, but I'm also cynical enough to know that we have a tendency to want to confirm what we're looking for, what we're already looking for, and that it might be called confirmation bias or attention bias. And so when things didn't have answers, events didn't have common sense answers to them, and it seemed like it was the probabilities against chance with very very low probability of these things happening in the framework in which we say things should happen. It was so curious to me that I knew that something about the mind and its connection to its environment had a big impact on how these things work, whether you call it luck, whether you call it synchronistic events, serendipitous events, fortuitous events that just happen at the right time. But it's always when there's a certain principle in place, like Like when you let go. Like, why is it when people let go, whatever that means, right? That things just seem to work out sometimes. So I was very curious about that. I spent my whole life asking one question, how does consciousness, how do our thoughts, how do our feelings in our body result in creating behaviors that create results in our lives, if they do at all? And that's what got me on this journey of understanding what it is we do and how we do it. And you talked about a moment ago. You talked about cross disciplines, right? To me, that's what works in changing someone's belief system, or changing my life at least, as well as my clients. Is this I combined Skinner's operant conditioning with CBT, challenging thoughts, NLP, mindfulness that's measured with biofeedbacks, especially peripheral biofeedback.
And we're going to have a podcast about all those modalities.
Yeah, we're going to be talking about that. That's going to be fun because we're going to be looking at measurements, right? That's what my journey is. So once I removed my depression, my fear, my anger, and manifested the life I envisioned, I looked at the principles that were involved in making that happen. And then I went out and I searched for interventions that touted these principles. And they were these interventions: biofeedback, mindfulness, NLP, what's called MER or timeline therapy, hypnosis, obviously, that's the foundation of this work. And just understanding the nature of consciousness and how it relates to Hindu and Buddhist ideas of that being fundamental and everything else being something that passes through it.
You mentioned consciousness, and consciousness is the biggest example I can think of, or like one of the most striking examples of how to go against dogma. Because consciousness, I don't believe you can understand it within just one discipline. And yet, when you talk about consciousness in physics, people have a certain idea, if they even speak about consciousness in physics, because in many environments, that's too way out there to be taken seriously, which again goes to the motivation of having this podcast. If you talk to a psychologist or to people in the psychology discipline, that's another thing. And it's usually my model is the one true model. And my discipline has holds the keys to the truth, to the ultimate and absolute truth. If you talk to someone who's in
a
neuroscience, exactly,
these consciousness or these networks of default network, that must be consciousness, because that's what's happening when we're just
and
being.
If you talk to someone who's looking at the chemistry of the brain and the biology, it's going to be a different. If you talk to a medical doctor who has been doing anesthesia for I don't know how many years, you're going to get a different answer. And I believe that this is one of the big examples when you see that if these people will just get together and talk with an open-minded spirit, you will have much more progress than you have right now. So this is one of the big examples that I can think of in which dogma basically holds back progress.
So that's the reason for this podcast. There's a lot of ideas that people call science or empirical data, right? That speaks to the foundation of our understanding about how we work. And oftentimes it's just somebody talking about something that they discovered 50 years ago. It's antiquated. And yet we're still talking about it as if it's... So everything keeps changing. And yet there's still people holding on to these old ideas, even when there's evidence that flies in the face of those ideas, right?
Yes.
The reason why I appreciate you as a scientist going down this road is because you confirmed for me that there are people out there that are interested in the truth and not just in dogma. So you're an astrophysicist as well as a hypnotherapist. So tell me about your journey.
Very much like you, when I was young, I was interested in the unknown and the inexplicable, the unexplained. And the most amazing thing to explain to me was the universe, the vastness, the mystery, that everything that was out there. And it started also from a philosophical perspective, like the big unknowns, the beginning, the end, the why, the how come. And I started studying astronomy and astrophysics at a young age, fascinated by the big unknowns. And even now, my work is mostly in dark matter, which is one of the biggest unknowns, and dark energy. However, I was also fascinated by these questions and the unexplained in many other fields. And one of the fields was hypnosis. I remember when I was a child and I was seeing this like stage hypnotist and seeing people sitting between two chairs and thinking like, where did gravity go? What's going on?
You mean when they were lying down between two chairs?
Right, like almost levitating, but
Right.
in between two chairs. And then it kind of followed me throughout my life, like an encounter here, a book there. I remember when I was one of the most amazing encounters that were related both with the physics side and then the hypnosis side was I was there for the unveiling of the solar plane. The solar plane is actually this invention that was, again, impossible if you were to ask people in academia. That was done in Switzerland. It's basically a plane that flies with absolutely no other power. Then during the day, it takes with solar panels the power from the sun, and it glides with using the same power during the night.
Wow.
This is absolutely amazing. Now, the person who funded the project is actually Bertrand Piccard. Is also the first person to ever do a non-stop balloon flight around the world in the 80s, and a couple of other interesting expeditions. And at that time, he was also the president of the Medical Hypnosis Association in Switzerland. And why is this interesting? Why is interesting is because while I went there to see the marvel of technology that was the solar plane, I came back with a lot of information about hypnosis. The two pilots, Bertrand Piccard and the pilot of the solar plane, they both use self-hypnosis to be able to stay awake and alert for long periods of time. They also use hypnosis for regulating their body temperatures, because in the cockpit, it can be from like minus 40 degrees Celsius at night to plus 40, if not more, during the day, and they have to regulate the response of their bodies to such huge differences in temperature. I remember one of the amazing stories was when they were doing the simulation flight, and Bertrand Piccard had to be awake for like 72 hours, and was told again by the people by doctors and other people that no, it's you can't do that to stay awake and still be functional 72 hours. So he called a friend of his who's was a hypnotist, and lo and behold, that was working. And even during the flight, they were doing these half hypnosis techniques to kind of go to sleep for 20 minutes and then wake up and all that. And since then, I had a series, when I moved to LA, I had a series of low probability events. This is how I call them, of course, low probability until they happen, that put me in alignment with finding out about HMI, the Hypnosis Motivation Institute. And I remember thinking, because I was driving past it, there's this big sign on 101. If anyone knows LA, it is like a huge freeway that says Hypnosis Motivation Institute. Now, people with my suggestibility, and we're going to be talking about suggestibility later on, don't necessarily have the tendency to see these kind of things, especially when they're driving. It was fascinating that once I found out from a friend about it and I got enrolled and all that, the next day, it was the first time that I actually saw the sign, and I was imagining how frustrated the universe must be. It's like, we put a freaking sign in front of you. So it was...
There's something so natural and something so unnatural about an astrophysicist saying the universe was talking to me. Isn't that interesting?
Have you got my quote?
It's so woo-woo on one level, but you're an astrophysicist. That is your research in the universe.
So if there was anyone that the universe would speak to, that would be me. Let's have this clear, right?
There you go.
There's anyone that the universe is speaking to.
You have your card. Yeah. Right.
They have my number, right?
They get your number, yeah.
So once I got into the study of hypnosis, and I was so fascinated about all the modalities and all the cool things, and that's how I met you, and we started talking and thinking about all sorts of like experiments and exchanging information and exchanging this perspective. This is how I basically got into hypnosis and hypnotherapy. And at some point I realized, because I never thought, I always approach it from the point of view of like the scientist, like wanting to know stuff and to test stuff and all that. But once I've figured, like I've seen how easy it is to help people, I got attracted to actual hypnotherapy, like also the therapy part of the hypnosis. And
so you first were interested in the science aspect.
Right. It was the science and, again, curiosity. And this is how I got where I am, basically, in this conversation. And that's another thing. Like, we are, like, I'm an astrophysicist. You're a hypnotist. We can walk into a bar, basically, and have a normal conversation without killing each other, without, learning from each other and evolving, rather than getting caught in this like dogmatic war in between two models that don't have to be exclusive, don't have to be... Again, I might use things that are not very familiar, and you might use things that I find that are not very, like scientific, but we can explain them both. I think science itself has to evolve. And also the other disciplines don't need to reject science.
Right.
I mean,
it works both ways.
Yes. There's a lot of rejection there that doesn't need to be. I mean, it doesn't need to happen.
I know. I believe that Reiki is now allowed in hospitals and has been for a while because they showed efficacy, right, in hands-on healing, that it had an effect, clearly, right.
Meditation has been used in schools for improving focus. Hypnosis has been used in brain surgeries. Right. So it's this whole perception that everything that's unexplained has to be unscientific. And that's another thing. People, when they speak about, I mean, in my field, physicists even refer to psychology as being a pseudoscience. Talk about egos and super egos. But the thing is, like, being a pseudoscience, by definition, is not a bad thing. It just says that you don't have... I mean, it puts the blame on both sides. You don't have the methods, first of all, to
isolate
to test it, and it doesn't. On the other hand, by design, with your methods, it doesn't submit to the scientific testing. So you don't have the scientific methods to test or like make predictions or like test the predictions of this theory. It doesn't mean it's wrong. People think, oh, pseudoscience means it's wrong. No, pseudoscience means it's not. Science may have some scientific claims, but with the methods that we have, we can actually come to a conclusion. To that, in that frame of reference, cosmology is a pseudoscience. And I'm the one who says it. Yeah, I know again what T-shirt I'm buying. So because you don't have all the methods to have the experiment over and over and over again in the lab. You're just testing models and trying to bridge different bits from different sources, like observations on one side with your theoretical models, with basically some universe replicas that you've simulated on your computer and other things. But when you think about it in this frame of reference, where you can't actually have an experiment and repeat it and get the same results, even cosmology falls into that category. That's why I think it's important to have this conversation, that we're having at a larger scale.
Yeah, cool.
So, with your experience in neurolinguistic programming and hypnosis and all that, where would you start? Because you have to start with an individual, right? And a system of beliefs. Let's talk a little bit about how you build a system of beliefs.
So human beings are interesting. We're meaning makers, right? And the brain is a very powerful organ, right? It's basic. I like to call it an intention organ, right? We are looking around in our environment and we want to survive. And part of that survival for mammals is to fit in and to connect, obviously. And so we have these intentions, and these intentions, usually left alone, allowed the feedback to be learned from and processed, and the emotions that accompany the feedback. We move towards our goals. We figure out how to get things done. But oftentimes, when the emotion is too intense, or just for no other reason that we didn't learn from what we needed to learn from the feedback or that moment, we have this ability to create a meaning around something. So we're able to, for example, you got a child whose parents are late for school or something. It's their first day at school. And they walk in late, and so everyone has already bonded. This is very common, by the way. And the child walks in and sees all these children turn and look at them while they were bonding and having a good time. Now they all look at them. That child's nervous system, autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic branch, goes from 0 to 10, and not knowing what to do with this information. So what should happen, ideally, is the child is supposed to process this emotion and learn, and hopefully a parent is with that child so a child can learn that this moment is a passing moment, and it just didn't match what the child would like to fit in, right? So a smart parent would say, it's okay, they didn't know you and they all got to know each other. Tomorrow we'll show up really early and you bond with the first child. And that moment would be over, that moment will be, that challenge, that's what I'm talking about. The challenge will be mastered, and the emotion and the belief will not be there. There won't be any belief. There will just be, now I understand how to fit in. Maybe show up early, or maybe work my way into a group slowly. But if that child makes a decision in that moment, it takes that emotion becomes a glue to the belief and this pattern in the brain. And it says, I don't fit in. I'm not good enough. No one likes me. I don't belong, maybe, right? And so that as soon as we give it a meaning, we actually take an emotion that was supposed to be feedback, and we make the emotion our default. And we have the pattern that was supposed to be feedback and make that permanent. This impermanent pattern becomes permanent. And now we have this impermanent pattern and impermanent emotion becoming permanent. And so now we start to filter everything through that feedback system. And then we create these self-fulfilling prophecies because it was an emotional experience. So it was a threat to the system. And so while the child is growing up, they get excited when they fit in, but they don't really register it. They just delete it, or they'll distort it into it's just a matter of time, or they don't really like me. They just did it because they just showed up because of my birthday. And their brain will continue to scan for that evidence. Someone else who has that experience that never had the belief, it's not a big deal. When no one shows up, or people look at them strange, or they show up to a party, they make a joke out of it. They show up and everyone looks at them and says, did I break a window or something? They'll have fun with it because they don't have this self-fulfilling prophecy. So from those core beliefs, and these are some of them. These are the ones I've worked with over the years. I'm not enough. I'm not good enough. something inherently, that's an addiction, big one. There's something inherently wrong with me. I'm broken. I don't fit in. I'm bad, big one, with shame. And of course, there are the surface experiences that create beliefs like I'm ugly, I'm not wanted, I'm unlovable, another big one. And these beliefs now are the foundation for other beliefs to build upon. And then suddenly we're 15 or 18 or 19, and everything we experience is experienced through that belief. And we will delete any evidence that goes against it. We will distort any evidence that really isn't necessarily, and we'll just distort it into, see, there it is again. No, wait, what are you talking about? Yeah, no, there it is again. You see, they left. But they left because they were an emergency. No, they didn't. And we'll just generalize everything as that idea. And unfortunately, all the vision boards in the world, right? All the affirmations in the world, unless they're done a certain way, they're going to not only bounce off that belief system, but actually trigger it to double down. And so it creates even more pain if you don't know what you're doing with those affirmations or beliefs or whatever modality you're trying to use to change your life, even hypnosis, hypnotic suggestions. If you don't give room to the images and the beliefs that were there while allowing the new ideas, and in hypnosis we call it deepening techniques, right? And in other areas, in biofeedback, we call it the opposite of that is the mindfulness part, is to become friends with those emotions, process them back into the system so we have more room to take in a new idea rather than be afraid of that emotion. As soon as we're afraid of that emotion, we keep that glue together that keeps the emotion, the pattern going. And this is why it's so difficult for some people to change, because we don't understand this process and how, not only how it was created, but how we keep recreating it and reinforcing it. And one of the reasons, I'll just say this, is why we get confused is because if we have the wherewithal to get something, if we get kind enough, caring enough, we buy people things, we become beautiful or tough or whatever we need to do to feel like we're fitting in, to change our external world, we have two things that happen. We have hope. So that hope feels like there's an opportunity for change, unless we just go into the depression and just give up. And then when the situation changes, it feels like it ameliorates the discomfort for a moment. But all we're feeling is a combination of hope and excitement, and underneath that, fear of losing it. And so then we become addicted, if we found a way to control our environment, to creating those patterns. That's why you have someone who's always on, always funny, and you're just, okay, well, right now we don't want to be funny right now. We just want to talk, because they feel, the nervous system feels like the only way I can feel important or valuable and get rid of this emotion is to keep doing this behavior, this adaptation to the belief and the emotion in order to survive, basically. And this is why it's so difficult. So I would imagine in academia, it's the same thing. You have an idea, you came up with this wonderful study, you've worked 8 years trying to figure it out, or 50 years, and you finally figure it out, and the math works, right? And then suddenly someone comes along and says, I don't think math is working on that, and you go, wait a minute. We built the wing in the college based on this
with
your name on it, and we're going to now throw it out the window. It's not. I can see how that is possible. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating, because what you're talking about is at the level of what would be called the subjective experience, right? Like the individual, and at the level of like unconscious and automatic behavior. While in academia, in my field at least, people would consider themselves so above that, right? Everything
so objective,
is like so
right?
intellectual. Everything is like so conscious
and objective
and rational, right? And in fact, they are prone to making the exact same mistakes in one way, which are basically this deletion, distortion, and generalization is basically an illogical path, right? Because you delete things that will kind of challenge your belief system. You distort other information that is coming to you
to support
it, regardless of what the information is actually saying, and then you generalize it in an absolute model.
Right.
So it's fascinating that actually is also can be extrapolated to groups of people, right? And then also have a whole environment that, even though it pretends like it's so conscious and so rational and so on, is driven by exactly this type of mechanism: the deletion, the distortion, and the generalization. And it's fascinating because the more people you have supporting that, right, the stronger your belief is, and the stronger the so-called model is that supports that belief. And basically, this is how you create dogma.
It's also how you create your reality.
Right. The first step would be accepting that there are, or there may be, some other things out there that are not completely covered by your model or by your belief system or by your view of the world.
So can you talk about moments in history that we just assume that science made a logical progression and a reasonable progression, and yet little do we know might have been a hindrance to progress, and yet we're just assuming we made so much progress?
Again, we're not generalizing, right? So
Right.
there are examples in science where the status quo was challenged, but it took a very long time for the scientific community to accept the challenge and to admit that their model, that their established model, was actually wrong. There are also instances in which that didn't happen. So we're not trying to generalize this, but I would say that, at least based on my experience, and again, this is tricky, right? System of belief.
Yeah, are you generalizing my generalizations?
Probably.
No, that's right.
I've seen this happening more often than not in academia, especially in the scientific field. And one of the most famous examples is the geocentric model. So the geocentric model was the model where you have the Earth at the center of the solar system, and of course back then that was the whole universe. And then everything, the sun and the planets, are just rotating around the Earth. And it took almost 1,500 years for that view to be challenged. Even though before, like a few hundred years before, there were people saying, no, it looks like the sun might be in the center. It took almost 1,500 years for that model to be challenged. And while the geocentric model is credited to Ptolemy, it was until, again, 1500 when Copernicus said, no, we actually have the sun at the center of the solar system, and all the other planets go around the sun. Now, again, in this example, while it took so long for it to be challenged and the challenge to be accepted, has some, not to find an excuse for the model, but it has some empirical evidence, right? Because back in the day, with the knowledge back then, if you see the sun rising on one side of the Earth and setting down on the other side, that's the natural conclusion that one can come up with. So at some point, even the empirical evidence is tricky.
That blows my mind. That, I mean, it can't be any more empirical than that. The sun lifts and then it drops, and I saw it. Don't tell me that the sun doesn't go around this Earth, mm-hmm. right? And so, that opens up a whole new can of worms.
Right, and that's exactly like what's making me mad, because with all these examples in the history of science, and we're still kind of restraining ourselves from challenging, or at least accepting that some models may be wrong. Now there are fields like cosmology, like my field, where there's when you think about the universe and the large scale structures in the universe, you can't make an experiment where you rebuild that in a lab and you do it over and over and over and over again. So even more, you should be open to different models and possibilities, and use your imagination and all that, because you can't make a universe. I mean, again, you can simulate replicas on a computer, but first of all, they're never going to match exactly what you see outside, and those are still going to follow the model that you started, the first assumptions, the model that you started with. And to give you an example, it's fields like dark matter and dark energy. The science is not the same as it was when we were talking about geocentric model and all that.
That's another reason we're doing this podcast, because there's so much talk about people talk about dark matter, dark energy, simulation theory, string theory. And what I'm curious about here in future episodes, and why I'm doing this podcast, is because with all the other stuff I have to read, last thing I want to do is read a textbook on dark matter or on cosmology, and so even though I do have a couple I've read, and one of them were your books, was your book, but to just kind of sum up, to clarify distortions for people who misunderstand what we're talking about when it's superposition, things like this. That's what I'm fascinated about, getting into those podcasts on just understanding in a nutshell dark matter. And then we can go deeper into it for those who are interested. But in a nutshell, what dark energy is, dark matter, simulation theory, string theory, superposition, non-locality, right?
That's and again, just a short point here. That's another thing that's making me mad, because depending on who you talk about those things, you will come, especially if you're not in the field, you will come with a certain knowledge because you respect the authority, right? This person is working as a researcher in this field, and they have authority and they know what they're talking about. And you come out of that podcast or whatever it is, like the popular science article, thinking that you understood something and you know something. And what it comes down to is that person basically popularizing the one model that their beliefs submit to, let's say, and that's about it. I've rarely seen people speaking about, okay, this is the most favored model, or this is the most preferred model, but A, B, C, D, E, F, G, or we could be completely wrong.
Right. So they just come out like this.
That I want to have.
They just come out like, I just read it, and so it has to be the way. So you're an idiot for even bringing it up. This actually happened to me. I was doing a talk about these anomalous events in my life, and I said at one point, the only way I can explain this scientifically, I have no idea how this works, but the only evidence I've seen that this could be how this might have happened, or how these anomalous events happen, these miracles happen, is from superposition and things like this. And this guy showed up and he said, do you know what rubber science is? And I was just like, yeah. He says, well, when you were talking about, that's not how it works. I said, did you hear anything I said? And I thought it was funny because I was very clear that I'm not saying that this is how you manifest your reality. I'm just saying that when I do these things and something shows up, something that is very, very, very high, low probability of it showing up, that's the only way I can imagine why those things happen.
Right.
And yet you still think because you read a book, how these things happen, because you have a title or you went to a seminar or something.
But I understand the trigger here, since we're talking about hypnosis and triggers. I do understand the trigger here because I've seen it. And again, that was a little bit of distortion on the part of the person for sure. But I've seen things sort of the other way around.
Like
people
I'm with you.
That are completely out of the field, claiming and saying that, by the way, we know that dark matter is cold. And in case you didn't know, we're jumping now in between 11 dimensions. Those were not physicists. And I was thinking about doing the same thing that the guy did, except this time it was different. Like, those people were acting as if that's the
authority on that matter.
Not necessarily, even if they're not necessarily the authority, but they acted like. And I think it's the mistake of both the people who were presenting those models. Because if you hear, as I said before, if you hear someone who's a Nobel Prize winner speaking about a model like their model, you're gonna come out of the room thinking, okay, that's the model. I mean, you don't believe that person. Who
Right.
are you going to believe? And you go and, preach,
Propagate, yeah.
and propagate the same model. So it kind of like cuts both ways. But in your case, it was a clear example. You said, I want to figure it out. And the
Yeah.
only way that I can try and figure it out is this way.
Right.
And this is going to be fun because we're going to be talking at some point that these conversations happen a lot between psychologists and physicists. And while some examples are anecdotal and are fun to think about, when you think again from the perspective of progress and bringing these fields together to pick up whatever is good from each perspective in order to build a model that explains what we do and what we see and all these anomalies that we don't have an explanation for, it's still a challenge. Because again, the dogmatic view within my small group and then the department and then the wing of the university and then the universe and my discipline and then my university and then my country and so on and so forth. And this is the conversation I want to have. I want to have people that can step on the other side and say, they might be wrong, but I might be wrong, but we can all be wrong. That's the challenge of dogma.
Yeah, and it sounds like it's the perfect time for that, because if you're not willing to take in new information, you're a closed system. And so in order to continue to grow, but it's terrifying because every time you grow, a part of you dies. And I think that's one of the reasons why people need to hold on to the pattern, because they identify the familiar patterns as who they are, rather than the observer of those patterns or the experiencer that experienced the patterns in order to become automated pattern or belief pattern. And so I think that's the problem, as we start to identify with the patterns of thoughts that become so familiar that anything that goes against it means that we die because the patterns die. But if we continue to identify ourselves with just the consciousness and curiosity, the observer, then what happens is you start to see things you never noticed before. So
I want to also speak a little bit about the authority, because you brought it up earlier, and we were speaking about that, someone with authority and how that is important in creating a dogma and maintaining a dogma and maintaining a whole field under a dogmatic view or dogmatic model. I can think of again, most of these examples people would bring them up from religion, because those are the well-known examples. But I can think of examples in science when that happened. One of the examples in physics is Einstein. So Einstein was on both sides of the dogma and big authority figure, right? So he was at first against the established view, which was substantial ether. Substantial ether, it was this substance postulated to be the carrier of forces in the universe, and he was against it, and he developed special relativity, and it took not that long, like it took few decades for people, like 2 decades for people to embrace that theory
and give up ether. Substantially.
So not 1500 years, which is
right.
We're making progress.
Right.
However, he was at the time one of the fans, let's say, of this idea that the universe it is as it is. It's always been, it always is. Yes, of course, at the scale of galaxies, you have movements and you have stars bursting and but everything is like localized when you look at the whole universe as a whole. Yeah. So there were pieces of evidence coming from observations at that time. The telescopes were getting better and better and picking up information. So there was already evidence from the observations that might not be the case. So without getting into details, because we're probably going to have another podcast about this and going into the details, but the idea was that in order for him to reconcile the special relativity, and let's call it relativity, with the observations that were coming up, he needed to change his theory.
So he got hit with this new idea, basically, that the universe is expanding.
Well, it wasn't an idea that he wanted to entertain at all. So in order to, again, reconcile the evidence that could have been explained by the expansion of the universe, he tweaked his mathematical model by adding a term that he ended up years later calling his biggest blunder.
So the scientific version of I can't hear it, I don't see it, I don't see it, I can't.
I don't see it, I can hear it again.
I'm not listening to you.
Yes, and that was a term that was called the cosmological constant. As more and more observations were and data from the observations were pouring in, now the evidence was there. It was hard to delete it completely, and people started looking at Big Bang as a model for the universe.
Isn't that funny? I've always thought of Einstein as somebody who probably had something to do with understanding the universe as the Big Bang, but I guess it was the opposite. Interesting.
Once the idea for the Big Bang started coming in, and the expansion of the universe, and again, here are so many interesting and ironical anecdotes, like Hubble, who came up with the idea after Lemaitre, who was a Belgian priest.
A priest?
Who perhaps, yes, a priest,
who perhaps
wonderful. Wasn't taken so seriously. Because of that, in being credited with actually.
So you're saying to me a priest came up with this idea that there was a Big Bang, which might suggest there was a creator, which scientists would have a hard time with back then, right?
Well, he didn't come with the idea. He was the one who was basically.
Hubble was first?
No, Lemaitre was first.
Oh, Lemaitre. Okay.
But he's not the one. Actually, the person who came up with the idea, Fred Hoyle, the term he coined Big Bang as actually a put down, like whatever that model is.
Oh, he was
Big
making
Bang.
fun of the
idea.
He
was making fun.
Oh, how cool is that? So the Big Bang was just some sass, some
be careful.
Shade against
what you say. Yes.
It was some shade against the discovery of the.
And again, no lost irony,
universe.
Because now we call the model as exactly how it was coined by one of the people who were dismissing the model. That's what I'm saying. Is like at least irony works in science.
Right.
If dogma is not that challenged, there is a way to at least find the irony. Lemaitre was not the one who came up with the idea for the Big Bang necessarily. He was the one who was pointing out towards the evidence and saying, like, was the whistleblower, if you want, the one pointing out to the red flag and coming up with the model to fit the data and see that there's an expansion. And we call it now the Hubble law, but that whole thing, Lemaitre came with it before Hubble. And
so Einstein didn't like that, and he was holding on. And then he eventually said it was his biggest blunder. Is that what you said?
Yes, but the irony doesn't end here.
Oh, it doesn't end. It keeps going.
No, I said, so now he's like on both sides of the dogma. The third time is above dogma and beyond dogma. Because what happened was, as more data, and again, we're talking now 50 years from that time, the data was showing that the universe's expansion is actually accelerating. So this means that everything moves away from everything else, basically, with a rate that's actually accelerating. And that is the model, and we're going to have a podcast on that, and that is what we call dark energy, as the big unknown here. Which is the thing that pushes the universe in this accelerated expansion. So, interestingly enough, people, because out of respect for authority, once again, kept Einstein theory plus the big blunder term, the cosmological constant, but set the value to 0 once the community embraced the Big Bang as the model that favors or like fits best the observations. When the evidence for dark energy came about, people realized that actually, if the cosmological constant is having a real value, as it was originally intended, even though for completely different purposes, so like for the wrong reasons. But if you give an actual value to the cosmological constant, you have a model for dark energy. Once dark energy were discovered, they went back to Einstein and said, "Well, wait, what? That trick might actually work if we."
So you're saying that Einstein's an attempt to kind of dismiss the expanding universe. He came up with a formula, right?
For the expanding universe.
Wow. That's really cool. So that's an example. Here's Einstein, right? Talk about the authority figure, right? And he was just going, oh. No. And then the same thing happened, even though he didn't do this, he was more confused about it. It was spooky action at a distance, right? Non-local activity with the electrons communicating with each other, right? And he was saying, I don't want anything to do with that. Yeah. And I think it was Bohm who decided to take a look at that, right?
We're going to speak about that in detail, because again, especially once you get into the quantum world, all bets are off here, right, in terms of the models. And the same thing goes with the cosmology at those scales of the universe, where you can't have, as I said before, experiments in the lab where you can test your models. But at least Einstein, again, that's the thing, at least Einstein, to his credit, admitted.
Right.
Eventually, when faced with it, did not delete until like ad nauseam the evidence. It did not distort it again repeatedly, and he admitted the mistake. The problem is in models and with environments that actually do not admit that.
So that's why we're mad. That's why you're mad. Anyway.
That's why I'm mad.
Because they don't admit to the fact that they've held on to an idea, and then evidence comes back out to contradict that idea. And instead of saying, yeah, I'm into science and discovery, it's more like, I'm into my idea. Right?
My one true model. My model is the one true model. And it's so unscientific. So to me, another reason why I got into studying hypnosis and behavioral science was because I wasn't expecting this. I was very naive. Like you'd expect scientists to be, open-minded and all that. And I wanted to know what type of personality, if any, or what are the elements that will make someone, or like one person or a group of people, being attracted to this type of thinking and this type of environment and this sort of like a dogmatic type of environment. Because people are thinking about scientists, when they're thinking about scientists, they're thinking about, oh, those people like up there in the ivory tower with their minds up in the sky that have very little to do with the mundane. And you're expecting them to be curious and to be open-minded and to be driven by, changes and discoveries and all that. And in fact, when you think about, again, from the point of view of history of science, but also in society, the scientific community has been behind the progress in society. When you think about the fact that women were not allowed to study physics at the graduate level in one of the top universities in the world until the 70-something or 80-something, against, again, no actual evidence that they wouldn't be able to perform. The same thing in other universities. If they were having mathematicians coming from countries that they were considering inferior, and they were mocking them and not finding their, not crediting or not taking seriously their discoveries. So the scientific community was behind the changes and the evolution in society from the perspective of diversity and equality and all those things. So there was this kind of tendency to hold back to some values against what you would expect when you were thinking about, curiosity, progress, changes, which fascinated me. I wanted to understand, like, what's the framework in which you can have that if you're a scientist.
So it's almost like we have this internal pattern of beliefs and ideas and this pattern recognition. And some people will allow a new idea to come in to such a degree, depending on how much authority you have, how much they trust you, how open they are. And that idea will affect all the other structures. And depending how deep they are, or how open they are to the idea, how trusting they are in the idea, or willing to accept the idea, that belief and idea will supersede all the other, or usurp the rest of the system if it's strong enough. And that's why some people think that hypnosis is for not vulnerable, what's the word I'm looking for? A lot of people think that hypnosis is for gullible people,
right?
And it's not the case. It's more like gullible people, more like open. And then if you're more open, you're more likely to not need as much information when accepting idea. But if someone gets enough information and it makes sense to them, they're going to take the idea as well, even if it's not their idea, because it fits within their model to begin with.
Yeah, that's actually I have a story about that, since you brought up the suggestibility. And again, we're going to have a podcast on it. I mean, we're going to have a podcast on everything, so of course we're going to have a podcast on this. When you were talking about suggestibility, like if we were to break it down in just very brief two categories, would be people who take the information literally and people who take the information inferentially. And then on top of that, we would say that there are those people who are having such a strong critical filter, and most of the information they take is inferentially. And interestingly enough, people have associated that when teaching the model and when presenting the model with the scientists. Now, funnily enough, and again, I'm not trying to generalize here. I'm sure that there are people who fit into that suggestibility pattern in science. I'm sure I know some, but everyone else that I've tested actually fits in the box in which you take the information literally. Every single person that I tested in physics, in engineering, fits in the box in taking the information literally. And again, this is just suggestibility. We're not even getting into behavior right now, and the behavioral categorizations here fits into the other box. Now, since I mentioned the generalization, I also want to be clear on one thing. I'm not saying that everything, so I'm not saying that academia is all, or like the scientific environment is all dogmatic. There are places and there are instances where that's not necessarily the case. But I'm talking about the trend, right? And also, I'm not saying that everything that goes against dogma is true. There are things out there that are going to be proven wrong. There are things that are absolutely wrong when you look at them that go against dogma. What I'm saying is, first, the conversation should be had. Second, the one should look at every possible model that's within reason, and even the crazier ones. You never know what can come up. You should be able to still have the conversation.
Flat earthers.
Yeah, I'm.
Don't ever say flat earthers to an astrophysicist.
It's not even that. I know exactly, based on the deletion, distortion, and generalization model that you just described. I know people who are gonna hear that flat earth that you just said, take it completely out of the context, brand this whole podcast as, oh, those two people that speak about flat earth, and I even know what t-shirt I'm buying, what's gonna rise on my t-shirt. So yes, I mean, even flat earth, you should be able to have a conversation to prove the person that there's no such thing as flat earth, right? But the conversation should be had. It should be multidisciplinary. And I have so many examples, and I know so many brilliant minds that were told that their idea is impossible, that their idea doesn't work. And lo and behold, it was just a matter of time, and maybe sometimes few millions of dollars to prove the establishment wrong. So
Yeah,
It makes me mad.
it makes me mad.
And again, it's not just in science. It's not just in science. It's not just in even in the humanistic part of academia and all that. It happens in art. Right? There's so many examples in art with people that were doing things completely different, and they were valuable after 100 years after they died and all that. It's this human is not even its tendency as much as a preference, I don't even know, of like holding back that state, like being resistant to change and to the unknown. And we're going to explain what the subconscious and the unconscious part of the mind does. But you would expect that in fields like, science and especially cosmology or like quantum physics, people would be more open-minded.
I wonder if it's a control mechanism or it's just emerges out of people's just egos and personalities. I wonder, maybe it's a little both.
I think it's both. Yeah. This is us profiling that.
Yeah, that's us generalizing and distorting. Anyway, so yeah, we're going to be talking about hypnosis, NLP, biofeedback, dark matter, dark energy, string theory, simulation theory.
We're going to be speaking about also the double slit experiment, because that's a big
one. Double slit experiment.
Between the new age, right? Between the new age, the psychologists and the physicists, that's a biggie.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to that one. I'm going to watch that one. I have to be in that one. I wanted to watch that one. Go ahead. What are you going to say?
Spooky. That's a bit of a spooky action.
Also, random number generators. We're going to be talking about how they're affected through consciousness and intention. We're going to be talking about ESP.
We might even do some crazy experiments there.
We'll do some
be warned.
Yeah, we might do some really cool experiments on seeing without seeing, but we'll get into that. And
and we're going to have some great guests, some wonderful people who have been perhaps on both sides of the dogma, but they're now on our side of the dogma, and in different fields, thinking everything from like physics to anthropology to biology to engineering to arts to many other fields. And come back. You're thinking?
No, what I was thinking was that the way out of this trap into dogma is to make sure whenever you come up with an idea, whether it be just your own idea or a philosophical idea, if you're an academic or a researcher, right, and you come up with this idea, to make sure you present it as always, look at it as very curious rather than this is how it is. Because as soon as you say this is how it is, right, there's a lot of shame in having to admit that's not how it is. It reminds me of the cult leaders, right? There's a cult that a group of people got together and they thought Jesus was going to save them at a certain time and a certain place. And they gave up their money, their families, everything. They gave up their whole life, right, to be with this cult and to do what they needed to do because Jesus, I think, was coming on a spaceship or something. And
as it were,
that's how Jesus,
like one does.
Yeah, like one does. So the day that was supposed to happen, they're all waiting, and the day passes, and nobody gets on a spaceship with Jesus, clearly. And you could imagine how disappointed they were, and how embarrassed they were, and how filled with shame they were, and how not angry, probably more shame than anger, right? And then the leader of the cult came out and said, "Good news. We did so well that Jesus saved the earth." And everyone was so relieved.
No need to go on a spaceship.
They had their back door now. They didn't have to worry about feeling that they They identified with an idea to such an extent that anybody who questioned it questioned them and questioned their being, right? And they would attack or defend at all cost. And now they had this out, that it was because that's why it happened. And I think that is so important to understand and to remember every time we have a point of view, whether it be political, religious, medical point of view, whatever it is, to have the point of view out of curiosity rather than certainty. And not only certainty, but to defend it as identifying with itself rather than fusing with it, defusing from it. And I think that's imperative in keeping yourself from getting into that trap.
That makes perfect sense. And if you were to take an individual, like each individual one by one, it will probably work like 50% of the time. But when you look at these environments, especially in academia, they're created such that everyone who gets in is either with us in terms of embracing a model or against us. And then you think also it's not just a matter of behavioral. It's also a matter of getting the funding for your project. So it has ramifications in many other areas. It's not just one subconscious reframing that you can do, and or like dissociation or like whatever you want to call it, and get away from that. And
right. So the more outside the box, the less likely you are to be able to fund research and
to get funding, to get jobs even. And all that. So what's worth a brilliant idea if you don't have any way of researching it in those environments? So we're going to have this conversation. We're not gonna subscribe and definitely not submit to intellectual limitations. We're not gonna be suffering from academic constipation. And we are going to hopefully find some very interesting things and very interesting ideas out there. So people can find you at tabtechnique.com.
Mm-hmm.
Tab with 2 B's.
Tabtechnique.com, yeah. And where can they find you?
They can find me at QOOSP, QOOSP.
Oh, that rolls right off the tongue.
Yes.
Okay.
Which is half research center, half hypnotherapy practice. And the research center is built as a hub, as a multidisciplinary hub that will hopefully allow for us to have these conversations with different disciplines and do some really cool research projects that you won't be able to find in academia.
So we are mad.
We're definitely mad.
I'm Joe Tabanella.
And I'm Cinziana Paduroyo.
And we're mad.